Okay, so this is chapter 2, part 3. We're still talking about chemistry, and our focus for this part of the chapter is going to be on the unique properties of water. So, we're talking about water because water is essential to life. Living organisms could not survive without water. It is one of the most abundant molecules on the planet, and also one of the most abundant molecules inside of living organisms. It's critical to life. It makes up about 60 to 70% of the human body, and if we were to look at individual cell types, there are some cells where water is going to make up 90% of the cell. And that varies depending on what cell we're looking at, but obviously a huge part of body composition is water. Okay? And so obviously water is important for living things. So we talked at the end of the last part of chapter 2 about water and how water is a polar molecule. And we looked at the structure of water. So water is H2O. So there are two atoms of hydrogen covalently bonded to one single oxygen atom. And these bonds between the hydrogen and oxygen are covalent. They are specifically polar covalent, which means that there's an unequal sharing of electrons between oxygen and hydrogen. And therefore, when we look at a water molecule, we say it has polarity, right? It has partially charged regions. And so oxygen is going to have a partial negative charge because it's going to pull those shared electrons closer to it. And the two hydrogen atoms will be partially positive. Okay, not full charges, but partial charges. And so again, we have poles. We have charged regions. And so we say that water is a polar molecule. Because of that feature, water is able to hydrogen bond. Okay, and because of that interaction, intermolecular action, it gives water some really unique properties. And we're going to go through these unique properties. So we're going to talk about density anomalies. We're going to talk about high heat of capacity, or high specific heat of capacity, and heat of vaporization. We'll talk about how water is the closest thing we have to a universal solvent, and we'll talk about the cohesive and adhesive properties of water and how that's important in living things. We will also, at the beginning of the next part of this chapter, talk about the generation of pH and how water is involved in that. That's going to be in the next set of slides. So let's dive in here. And so before we get to those unique characteristics, I want to introduce you to two terms that you should be familiar with. You're going to see these throughout the semester, and so you want to make sure that you understand what they mean. So because water is polar, other substances that water is near will either be attracted to water or not. And so these are the terms hydrophilic and hydrophobic. And so these two terms are going to be used to describe the interaction of substances with water. And so let's start with the first term, which is hydrophilic. So hydro meaning water and philic meaning loving. So philic means having an affinity or being attracted to. And so hydrophilic substances, they like water. They love water. They want to be close to it. They're attracted to water. They have an affinity, a pull towards water. Okay? And so substances that are described as being hydrophilic, they're going to mix easily or dissolve easily in water. And that is because hydrophilic substances will have polar or partially polar or charged or partially charged regions that can form hydrogen bonds with water molecules. Okay? You'll notice that's a reoccurring theme as we go through this part of the chapter. Water is polar and it can hydrogen bond. Okay, so when we talk about all these unique properties, they're really all due to the fact that water is polar and water can form these forces, which we're going to call hydrogen bonds, really hydrogen forces. Okay, not very strong, but still a relationship there. Some examples of hydrophilic water-loving substances include sodium chloride, common table salt, right? We're going to look at that again a little bit later in this chapter, but you've seen it already, right? It will associate with water. It will dissolve in water. Sugar, same idea. When we get into the next chapter, when we talk about biologically relevant macromolecules, we're going to talk about phospholipids. And so I'm going to tell you that the polar head group of a phospholipid is hydrophilic. We'll also the structure of DNA. And so DNA and its backbone has negatively charged phosphate groups, and those phosphate groups are going to be hydrophilic. There are going to be regions on proteins that are going to be partially charged, and those are going to be called polar regions, and those are going to be hydrophilic. Okay? How about the other term, hydrophobic? Hydrophobic literally means water-fearing. And so these are going to be substances that are not attracted to water, that repel water. They don't readily dissolve or mix with water. They are non-polar. They are non-charged, or they have very weak polar regions. Okay? They're not going to interact with water, and in fact, they're going to push water away, and these types of molecules tend to cluster together to really minimize their contact with water. And so in this picture here, if you've ever made like salad dressing, if you've ever put oil into water, this is what happens. So these are little oil droplets, and they are literally repelling, pushing away, and clustering together. They don't want to associate with water. So oils will do this, fats, lipids, waxes. We will see this example again when we look at the phospholipid bilayer, which makes up the membrane around our cells. There's going to be a polar hydrophilic region, and then the core is going to be a non-polar hydrophobic region. So we're going to see this term again as it applies to biologically relevant macromolecules and structures in our cells. Okay, so you want to make sure you know the difference between hydrophilic and hydrophobic. Okay, so that brings us to states of water. And so water can exist as a gas, which is shown up here at the top. So this is gaseous water. And so if we were to look at water in this state, this would be, water that's been heated, so around 100 degrees Celsius, upwards of 50 degrees Celsius, water is going to start to vaporize. And so when we look at water molecules in the gaseous state or the vaporized state, you will see water molecules look like this. So you can see this is oxygen bonded to two hydrogens. Here's a second water molecule here, a third water molecule here, a fourth one here. You can see the space between them, and there is very little to no hydrogen bonding here. Okay? When we go to liquid water, so when we cool water down a bit, it's going to leave the gaseous state and become a liquid. Okay, so this is at about 50 degrees Celsius. So if we take a look at liquid water, look, the molecules are closer together, okay? And there's some hydrogen bonding, but not the maximum amount, okay? If we come down here, 0 degrees Celsius, right? Water's going to freeze. And actually, it's going to freeze around 4 degrees Celsius. And so here we've got ice, okay? It's sitting on top of liquid water. So if we were to take a look at the molecules inside of here, it would look like this. So you can see this lattice type structure. So each water molecule here is bonded to the maximum number of water molecules. So one water molecule could hydrogen bond with 4 other water molecules. And that's what's going to happen in this state of water. So when we have ice, solid, water, it is going to form this type of a structure. Okay, this is really important. Okay, so here it is again, showing the individual water molecules and how they are hydrogen bonded to the maximum amount. This creates a density anomaly. Usually when you think of a solid, you think of solids as being more dense than a liquid. In this case, ice, okay, solid water, is less dense than liquid water. And why is that? And that's because water reaches its maximum density around 4 degrees Celsius. Okay, so when it freezes, it actually reaches its maximum density. And so again, what does that mean? This is when there is the maximum number of hydrogen bonds between those water molecules. And so that makes ice less dense. If you look at liquid water, the water molecules are more closely packed together, making it more dense. Okay, so because of this, ice can float. So solid ice is less dense than liquid water, and so therefore ice floats. This is a unique property of water. Why is it important? Well, think about aquatic ecosystems, right? If ice didn't float, then small lakes or maybe even the ocean would freeze over in the winter, and that means that anything within that body of water would die. But instead, ice floats, and so when ice forms on top of these bodies of water, it's going to actually insulate and protect the aquatic organisms living below. And so this unique property of water enables aquatic organisms to live in these colder regions. Okay, so our second unique property of water is water has a high specific heat, and it also has a high heat of vaporization. Okay, so specific heat is the amount of heat needed to be put into a system in order to change the temperature of that liquid 1 degree. And so that number is high for water. It's the highest of any liquid on the planet. What does this mean? It has a high capacity to absorb and retain heat. Large bodies of water will take up a lot of heat that comes to our planet during the day, and then that heat is released into cooler air at night. This helps to regulate the climate. Okay, so again, larger bodies of water can absorb and release heat more slowly than land can. This unique feature also helps organisms to regulate temperature. Okay, so temperature of the planet, temperature inside of our bodies. The temperature of small and large bodies of water, they don't really fluctuate so much. Very minimal fluctuations in temperature. And so aquatic life living in smaller, large bodies of water are able to maintain homeostasis because the temperature is not, going way up and way down like it does on land. Okay. High heat of vaporization. So what does this mean? Requires a significant amount of energy to change from a liquid to a gas. So that's evaporation. This is really important. This allows water to absorb heat, and then when it absorbs enough heat, it can actually carry that heat away from surfaces. So that's evaporation, when water molecules change from the liquid to the gaseous state. And that requires energy, it requires heat. What's happening during evaporation, or anytime you have a change in state of matter, so if, say, you go from ice to liquid to gas, right? Heat has to be put in, and what that heat is doing is it's actually breaking the hydrogen bonds, and then allowing those water molecules to move fast enough to change state. But first, hydrogen bonds have to be broken. And that's why water has the highest specific heat. And that's why water has a high heat of vaporization. There's that other layer, that other level that has to be overcome before temperature can change or state can change. Evaporative cooling is really important to living organisms. It helps us to not overheat. So if you are exercising, your body temperature will increase. And how does your body handle that? Evaporative cooling. So your sweat glands are triggered to release sweat, and sweat is water, right? And so when that water leaves your body and then leaves the surface of your body, that's your way of cooling down. It takes that heat with it. Okay, so that's evaporation. Okay. Water is the closest thing we have to what we call a universal solvent. So what does that mean? That means if something is capable of being dissolved, water will be able to dissolve it. Okay? So a solvent is going to be the dissolving agent. So water, again, is the universal solvent. It can dissolve stuff. When we talk about solutions, there's always going to be a solvent and a solute. The solute is whatever is being dissolved by the solvent. And so in this example that I have here on the right, we're taking common table salt, so sodium chloride, which is NaCl. Remember, that's an ionic compound. And we're shaking it into a beaker of water. Okay, and so the water is going to dissolve the salt. And how does it do that? It does that through dissociation of those sodium chloride ions through the formation of what we call a hydration shell. And so what is a hydration shell? We've got it shown here. Okay, so here is one hydration shell around this chloride anion, and here's a second hydration shell around this sodium cation, and so on and so forth. And so the hydration shell is water molecules surrounding a particular, in this case, ion, and keeping them separated from each other. And so why does this happen? Because water is polar, and because these are charged ions. And so the partially charged regions of the water molecule will be attracted to and will hydrogen bond with these different ions. Okay, so the partially charged regions here, these partially positive hydrogens, will associate with this fully negative chloride, and these partially negatively charged oxygens will associate with this positively charged sodium. Okay, this fact that water can dissolve stuff is essential to the survival and function of living organisms. Again, living organisms are made up of 60 to 70% water. Water is going to be essential for nutrient absorption. It's essential for metabolic reactions that are taking place in the cytoplasm of our cells. It's important and essential for waste removal. Okay, all of these things involve water acting as a solvent. Okay, we're almost there. We're on our last two features, and so we're going to talk about cohesion and adhesion. And let me move my camera so that you can see this cool picture. So cohesion is the attraction, the attractive force of water molecules to each other because of hydrogen bonding. Okay, so cohesion, you can think of water molecules literally kind of sticking together. Okay, because of this, there's a lot of things, right? But the thing that I'm showing here is surface tension. So what is surface tension? Again, it's water molecules sticking together, especially at the surface of a body of water. And at that surface, there is so much kind of hydrogen bonding and water sticking together that it creates what's like an elastic sheet over the top of that surface. Okay, and so water has what we call high surface tension. So it has a high capacity to withstand breaking when placed under tension or stress. Okay, so in this example here, we've got three different organisms that are able to actually walk on water without sinking. Now they're small, they don't weigh too much, right? And they're not breaking the surface. So that surface tension is keeping them above water. So there's one example, and these organisms rely on that in order to survive. There are other examples as well. So if we look into the soil, water is going to form spherical shapes around soil particles and around roots, which is going to assist roots in pulling up water from the soil. Okay. Okay, so that's cohesion, and we'll talk more about cohesion on this slide and the next slide, but I want to introduce you to the next concept here. It's actually the last concept here. Okay, so adhesion. So cohesion is water molecules sticking to other water molecules, and adhesion is going to be water molecules sticking to other surfaces, okay? Still because of hydrogen bonding. And so that leads to a property called capillary action. And so in this figure here, I've got a beaker, which contains water, and in that beaker I have a capillary tube, which is just a glass thin tube that I stick into this water. And without applying any energy to the system, what's going to happen is water is going to go up into that capillary tube. And the reason why water moves up in that capillary tube is because of adhesion and also cohesion. So the water molecules are going to be sticking to the sides of that glass, and they're also sticking to each other, okay? They're going to be pulled upwards. If we have a small tube, like a capillary tube, if there's a natural tendency for that water to stick to the sides and be pulled up. How does this apply to living organisms? Well, on the next slide, I'm going to show you how this allows for transport of water in plants. And we could also think about this as helping blood move through small vessels in our circulatory system. Okay, well, we're going to focus on transport in plants. So again, both adhesion and cohesion are at play here. And so here is my plant. It's a pretty tall tree, right? And we need to get water from here in the ground all the way up to where photosynthesis takes place, which is up here in the leaves. And we're not going to use any energy to do that, okay? This is going to be a purely solar-powered process, which is driven by the process of transpiration, which I'll talk about in just a second, and we have adhesion and cohesion. So let's take a look at this. So up here at the leaves, where again photosynthesis is taking place, because of differences in water potential, which is something we'll talk about in general biology too, there is a tendency, a natural tendency for water to be pulled out of leaves, okay, and into the atmosphere. That's going to just happen naturally because of, again, differences in water potential. And so because of that process, that's called transpiration, water is constantly being pulled out of leaves, and therefore that pulling at that site of the leaves is going to trickle downwards. So water is going to be pulled up the plant because of transpiration. Now, where is it getting pulled from? All the way down here in the roots. So water's going to enter the roots from the soil, and once that water is inside the root, it's going to literally be pulled up. It gets pulled up in very specific structures called xylem. And so here is a picture of xylem. And you can see that they're different sizes, but if you look at any of them, what they are is literally hollowed out tubes, like straws. So you can kind of picture this as water being sucked out of the plant by a straw at the very top. And water is going to be pulled up that straw. So again, the straw is called xylem. And xylem is continuous from roots through stems into leaves. They're continuous structures. And so if we were to look at the water inside of a xylem element or a xylem vessel, what we would find is that the water in there, those water molecules, are sticking to each other, and they're sticking to the sides because of hydrogen bonding. Because of that adhesion, sticking to the walls, and cohesion, sticking together, water is able to literally be sucked up. It's like they're all holding hands, all the different water molecules, and they're tugging on each other. And so if one's getting tugged from the top, everybody below is getting pulled on as well. Okay? And so here we go. Here's one water molecule, here's a second one, and this dotted line between them, that represents cohesion. And again, cohesion here. And you can see this water molecule is stuck to the side. So there's an example of adhesion. Okay? And so you want to make sure that you know the difference between cohesion and adhesion and how they're applied in living systems. That's the end of part 3.